Now, how that had been then structured was even more creative than what had happened before. So if you then look at the people that were very important in the transaction, is that whatever transaction that involves the Reserve Bank has to have the buy-in from the governor of the Reserve Bank. Okay. Now you have a company called Sanlam which owns this particular bank, and then this bank is struggling, and Sanlam is like, yo, we need to bail this thing out, but we don't have the funds to do it, or we don't want to do it. So Sanlam has a board of directors, and then that board of directors then says we own the bank, which is Bancorp, and that also has a board of directors. Then you've got the Reserve Bank governor, and then you've got the finance minister. So these are the key role players, okay? So then they say, well, actually, the easiest way to do this is to create a space for the conversation to happen within the Reserve Bank. So the governor of the Reserve Bank cannot walk into an FNB branch now and say, are you guys struggling? That's just very illegal. But what the governor of the Reserve Bank is able to do, he's able to have a conversation with the board of directors of the Reserve Bank and say, guys, let's talk about the system. So Sanlam was very clear in that they said, okay, Anton Rupert, which is your aunt's father, you need to become a director at the Reserve Bank, because then you can feed in information into the Reserve Bank on a legitimate basis. So that's how the Reserve Bank knew that the bailout was needed. Okay, so Rupert becomes a director there, and it makes things easy to facilitate. So once he's an insider, then he's able to legitimately tell the governor that we might need to do this. But you can't write a letter to the Reserve Bank governor tomorrow and say, please bail out VBS. It's just simply not allowed. Okay, so that's how you structure this. So he gets in there, and then he says we need to facilitate this bailout. So the guys that actually now are owning Sanlam, one of the directors, his name is, I think, Abraham du Plessis. Okay, so he then says, guys, I think we need to make this approach to the Reserve Bank. And then everybody's like, but no, if we make this approach, the Reserve Bank will have to go to the finance minister and ask for permission to do this. He's like, well, that's fine. The finance minister is my brother. Yeah. So that made it simply easy. So they simply said, okay, make all these things happen. And it was that particularly easy for them. One of the other directors that was actually sitting on Bancorp, who actually signed off on this particular transaction, was a guy called Derek Keys. Right? So when du Plessis, the senior brother, stopping the finance minister, his successor was Derek Keys. So they had all the people lined up who would actually lend an air of legitimacy to the transaction. So if you simply look at the legal documents, it's actually an airtight transaction, and you have to commend them for that, as it were. So my point of departure with the whole Absa narrative is that Maria Ramos wrote a response a couple of weeks ago, and she said that, look, when we acquired this bank, we bought it at fair value. And I was very clear that she's talking absolute rubbish. Now, the problem here is that I'm worried for the shareholders and the customers of Absa today, because they seem to have a CEO who doesn't understand what fair value is, because she had a really wrong interpretation of what fair value is. So the concept of fair value is, I need to buy this laptop, okay? So if I need to buy this laptop, I need to go to a shop in Braamfontein and say, what's the price of the laptop? And whatever price is available to you, myself and everybody else, that's the market price, as it were. So that's what the concept of fair value is. The problem with the assets that the Absa bought, which made up Absa, is that one of the assets was this whole Bancorp transaction. And my argument is that this Bancorp asset that you say you bought at fair value, that asset was actually worthless until the South African taxpayer stepped in to bail it out. So you can't say that you bought that asset from Sanlam, because the asset was of no value to Sanlam until the state said we're actually going to make it of particular value. So when you say you bought it at fair value, it means you either don't understand fair value or you're simply lying about it. So the basis of my argument is to say that when Absa was formed and they bought that particular asset, that asset belonged to the South African taxpayer, because it only existed because the South African taxpayer had put in 1.5 billion rand to make it happen. So the way I explain it, even to the people at Absa, is to say, you need to go back as Maria Ramos and say, in 1991, when we bought all these banks and we called it Absa, because Absa is simply an amalgamation of different banks. So it's the amalgamated banks of South Africa. You need to tell me that when you bought all these banks, how much money did you allocate to buying Bancorp? And what percentage of your asset base did it make? So if it turns out that Bancorp made up 20% of the original asset base of what Absa is, it means that 20% of Absa today belongs to the South African taxpayer. So it's not a 2 billion rand conversation. It's much bigger than that. So when the public protector said the answer is 2 billion, I'm like, oh, no, you definitely have it wrong, because that's not how it works. And the reality is that, luckily now, we actually have precedent. We've got an indication of how these things are done. So when we had the international financial crisis around 2008, a lot of the banks were failing, and taxpayers were then asked to step in and bail the banks out. So one example was the Royal Bank of Scotland in England. So essentially, nobody wants to buy the bank, so the taxpayer says, we'll take over this bank, however much it costs, and once the bank is stable again, then we'll sell it back. So essentially, that is the same conversation that we had with Bangkok in 1991, because we said, we will keep you going, which means that you actually do belong to the state, and once you guys are back on your feet, then we'll sell it to somebody else. It just happens that when the government sold Bangkok back to Sanlam, they didn't charge them a single cent. And for me, that is what needs to be recovered. So if you say, let us have the conversation of how much Bangkok made of the original asset base of Absa, and the number turns out to be 20%, it turns out, it appears then that the market value of Absa today is around 100 billion rand, which means that 20 billion of that Absa stake must actually then be given to the state. That's how a bailout works in every other situation. So that's where the situation is now. What has happened with the public protector's report is that she has limited her calculations to the essence of what the missing interest is. Okay, and I'll tell you how she worked out the interest first. But the first issue with the whole Absa conversation is that Maria Ramos is obviously lying about the whole conversation. She's not disputing that we bought a tainted asset. And when people talk about tainted assets, it always drags me back to the original conversation of what went wrong with the ANC's transition. So a lot of the things that went done properly around 1993 and 1994 were on the basis that if we actually fix this, it will destroy the system at large, and then the rest of the world is going to reject us. Excuse me. And one of the key issues is, why did you decide that you're going to pay all the apartheid debts? That's right. So it was a lot of money that was owed by the National Party government to the world, the IMF, and all these particular banks. And then the ANC said, we will get into government and then we'll pay off all those debts. And my argument is to say, look, Cyril Ramaphosa is known as a great businessman. He is no such thing. He couldn't even negotiate that, because for me, I would have said, look, all the international people that are owed by this particular government, you can go back to them as the ANC and say, guys, from 1912 up to 1993, which is about 8 years, we've been telling you that this is an illegitimate state. So you've consciously dealt with an illegitimate state. You've been dealing with a thief. I'm not going to step in and pay that off. So all the international players actually knew that they were dealing with an illegitimate state. So how do you then legitimize all their criminal transactions by saying that we're going to step in and pay for them? So that's where it really went wrong. So it's the same situation with Absa, because I'm like, well, when you bought this asset, you did do your research and say, but where did these assets come from? So you're well aware that you bought a tainted asset. If you didn't bother to ask how this transaction ought to be finalized, then you are simply incompetent. Not only racist, but primarily incompetent. So that's the starting point. And then the secondary issue is that to say, okay, there have been rumors that the money was paid back, but they're struggling to explain when and how. Because the money was never paid back. And part of all these reports that have been commissioned have been very clear that clearly something needs to be paid back. So of the three main reports, there's the one that Absa is now talking about, which was the one that was written by Judge Davis. Judge Davis is not an expert in finance. He'll be the first person to tell you that. He's an expert in law, and he was trying to evaluate an illegal transaction. And his conclusion was that it is an illegal transaction. When it came to the issue of finances, he completely got it wrong, because he said, okay, fine, there's money that needs to be recovered, but I think the money should be recovered from Sanlam and not from Absa. That's a matter of semantics, because Absa was obviously the parent that benefited. So if they decide to step in and pay, then that's fine, they must pay. But what Maria is now relying on is the fact that David said that, I don't think Absa should pay. I think the parent of Absa should pay if there's anything to be paid back. That was his first issue. And then the second one was that he said, well, I actually don't think you should go and ask for the money because it's going to disrupt the system. Now, for me, for a country that is so very keen on talking about corruption and theft, it's very difficult to reconcile the idea that in this particular transaction, everybody agrees that something was stolen, and then they say, don't get it back because it's going to disrupt the system. So I can go and steal your car, but when you come to try and collect your car, I'll be like, look, if you try to take your car, my kids won't have a way to get to school. So let it go. I mean, it just makes no sense to me. So that's where the situation ended up. And at some point in time, Absa actually made peace with the fact that they'd have to pay the money. So they actually made an allowance in their own financial statements to say, we're going to pay this. And then the NC government simply never bothered to ask them to collect it, to ask them to pay. So then Absa eventually said, clearly these people are never going to ask for the money, so let's stop worrying about it. So Absa is not new to the conversation. They know very well what the transaction is all about. They've committed to paying before, and then the NC decided that they shouldn't pay. So now what creates the tensions in the system is the question of, will the ANC then backtrack on its word and say, actually, guys, you do actually need to pay this? And I don't think any of them are in a position to dispute that the transaction happened. That's why they're all struggling now to say, well, what the issues were and what not. So they're trying to create a smoke screen around it. I'm like, no, here's the information. It's your responsibility to disprove it. And they're not in a position to do so because they actually did steal the money, as it were. So the one thing that's important about Absa is that what makes Absa quite unique is that perhaps they were clumsy in creating it. Because my view has always been, you need to go back to the JSE listing in 1993 and ask every single one of the companies that are listed in the top 50 of the JSE to explain exactly how they had managed to thrive and become multi-billionaire entities operating within a country that had so many sanctions. It could only be possible if they had some backdoor deals that were funded by the state. Because a lot of people now say, you don't want to get, junk status. And then I always say, but we've been in junk status before, and you had all these entities that made multi-billion profits. Because up until 1994, nobody was dealing with South Africa. There were all these sanctions, and these businesses found a way to thrive. And I'm saying, look, you can't hold me to ransom on the basis of that a downgrade is going to create problems, because I'm like, we've done this for over a 40-year period and we still were able to create an economy. Why can't we do it now? So you have to be able to try and interrogate why people would say particular things shouldn't or shouldn't be done and what it is that they're trying to defend themselves against. The other problem that we have as South Africans, unfortunately, is that we have this very big bias or this reliance on things called ratings agencies. Ratings agencies were discredited in 2008 because they couldn't tell what was happening in their own market. So I personally, I've studied finance. I can tell you exactly why ratings agencies are not the thing that you should look at. Okay, the one problem, unfortunately, with ratings agencies in in the South African context is that if you had to go and ask, okay, this junk status threat that we have, what precipitates it? So people will tell you that a country that gets downgraded to junk status is one that has these particular features. So the economy is not growing, people are unemployed, there's no infrastructure development and all these things. What you will then find is that all the parameters or all the checks that they say, if a country has these things, it must be downgraded immediately, happened in South Africa 2 or 3 years ago. So South Africa should have been downgraded about 2 or 3 years ago into junk status. The reason it hasn't been done is that ratings agencies have evolved from being rating agencies to being political influencers and political commentators. So for them, it becomes a matter of South African, the indicators will not change, but at some point in time, when they think that there's a political reason that they must do the downgrade, then they will do it. So what I'm waiting for is to say, okay, fine, downgrade us now. I want you to tell me exactly what has become worse, because we're still not going to be growing. We're at 0% growth. So I'm thinking, but what's going to get them to downgrade us then? Because we're already at rock bottom. So all these particular things, you look at them and then you're like, Esh. The problem with our politicians is that unfortunately they didn't study finance and economics very well, and that's what we're stuck with. Thank you.